The afternoon sun blazed merciless across the high plains. But Clara Hawthorne felt ice in her veins as she pressed her back against the splintered logs of what had been the Kowalski cabin just 3 days ago. Her fingers trembled against the rough wood, not from the heat that shimmered off the baked earth, but from the memory that clawed at her chest like a living thing. 10 years ago, beside the Missouri River, she had knelt in blood-soaked grass to bandage a stranger's wounds, while a frightened child watched from the cottonwoods. Now that same stranger stood 3 paces away, and the child, summer 1874, Colorado Territory. "Mama, why is that man looking at us?" Rose whispered, her 8-year-old voice thin as wire. Her small hand gripped 6-year-old Samuel's fingers so tightly his knuckles had gone white as bone. Clara's throat constricted. The warrior who faced them wore the eagle feather bonnet of the Lakota, each plume catching the light like captured flame. Nayati Ghostwalker Red Hawk to his people, moved with the fluid precision of a man who had spent 40 years reading death in every shadow. His weathered hands held a Henry rifle with the casual familiarity of prayer. But it was his eyes that stopped Clara's breath. Dark as winter water, they held recognition memory, and something that might have been sorrow. Between them lay the corpse of a hired gun, face down in the alkali dust. The tin star pinned to his vest was blackened with soot, not a lawman, but another of Abel Crick's enforcers come to finish what the wire syndicate had started. His blood had already begun to bake in the heat-drawing flies that buzzed lazy circles in the still air. The wind shifted, carrying the acrid smell of smoke from Cinder Bluff's main street, where buildings tilted at drunken angles, their foundations eaten away by floodwater that had roared down from the mountains like the wrath of an angry god. What had been drought for 3 months became deluge in 3 hours, and now the town was drowning in its own broken dreams. From the distant ridge came the rumble of hooves settlers fleeing to higher ground, if they were smart, if they were lucky. Most were neither. "Don't hurt my children." Clara whispered, her voice scraped raw from smoke and fear. Nayati's gaze never wavered from her face. When he spoke, his English carried the careful cadence of a man who had learned the white man's tongue from necessity, not choice. Each word was chosen like ammunition, precious, purposeful, final. Clara. The sound of her own name struck her like a physical blow. How could he? But even as the question formed, her eyes found the pale scar that snaked along his left forearm, jagged as lightning, where a grizzly's claws had opened him to the bone. She remembered the weight of his blood on her hands, the way he had watched her with those same winter water eyes while she worked to save his life beside a nameless creek. A massive cottonwood log, driven by the flood like a battering ram, smashed against the cabin's front step. The entire structure groaned, leaning further into its inevitable collapse. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, whether for the living or the dead, Clara couldn't say. "Water rises fast," Nayati said, gesturing toward the swollen creek that had become a brown torrent, carrying away everything in its path. Fence posts, wagon wheels, the bloated carcass of a mule. "We move now, or we don't move." Clara's hand went instinctively to her skirt pocket where folded papers rustled like autumn leaves. Inside that oilskin packet lay proof of crimes that reached all the way to the territorial capital. Forged mortgages, falsified claims, a systematic theft of water rights that had destroyed families like poison in a well. Her late husband, Edwin, had discovered the conspiracy she had always believed. His accident 2 years ago had been murder pure and simple. Now she carried the evidence that could bring down Abel Crick's wire empire if she lived long enough to present it to someone who mattered. "There's a boy still in town." Clara said, her chin lifting with the stubborn pride that had carried her through 2 years of widowhood and hardship. "Jimmy Morrison, the blacksmith's apprentice. He went to free the horses from the livery." Nayati's gaze flicked toward the stable where smoke still curled from the roof like an offering to indifferent gods. When he looked back at her, something had shifted in his expression. Not softness, but understanding, born of shared loss. "Save who we can," he said simply. Another log crashed against the cabin's foundation, sending vibrations through the walls that Clara felt in her bones. Samuel pressed closer to her torn skirts, his blue eyes wide with a kind of terror that left permanent marks on a child's soul. Without conscious thought, Clara stepped to Nayati's left side, positioning herself between him and the open yard, where death waited with infinite patience. It was a practical move. 2 pairs of eyes watching different directions, 2 bodies shielding the children from whatever came next. Nayati shifted to put his broad frame between the young ones and the broken street beyond. The movement was fluid, natural, like dancers who had practiced this deadly waltz 1,000 times before. Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the relief of shared burden, the comfort of a strong back beside her own. Thunder rolled across the plains like artillery fire, and with it came the sharp crack of rifles from the river street. Crick's men. Clara breathed understanding, flooding through her like ice water. "Wasichu always come when the water rises," Nayati said, the Lakota word for white man, carrying old bitterness. "Clean up what the flood don't wash away." Cinder Bluff had been dying a slow death long before the flood came to finish what drought and greed had started. Built where the Denver and Rio Grande spur line crossed Willow Creek, the town had thrived for exactly 18 months before the coal vein played out and the railroad moved its operations 20 miles east to richer ground. Clara knew the pattern by heart. She had watched it devour her neighbors one by one, the Kowalskis with their 3 tow-headed children, who had played with Rose and Samuel just last Christmas. Old Henrik and Astrid Lindqvist, who had given her preserves when Edwin died. Reverend Matthews, who had buried her husband with words about God's mysterious plan and infinite mercy. In her pocket, the papers felt heavier with each passing hour. She had discovered them hidden in Edwin's desk just days after the funeral documents that proved the water rights theft, but also raised questions about her husband's own involvement that she had never dared to explore. The truth, she suspected, would be more complex and painful than simple victimhood. The schoolhouse sat on slightly higher ground, its bell tower rising above the flood, like a lighthouse in a storm-tossed sea. Smoke drifted from its chimney, a hopeful sign that someone inside still drew breath and needed warmth. Miss Eliza Boone had taught most of the children in the valley since she arrived from Boston 3 years ago, armed with spectacles held together by wire and a backbone straight as any rifle barrel. The first rifle shot cracked like a whip, echoing off the canyon walls in diminishing waves. Clara instinctively ducked, pulling her children down with her as splinters exploded from the cabin's doorframe. Samuel whimpered and buried his face against her shoulder, his small body shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. "Mama." Rose whispered, her young voice trembling with controlled fear. "Are the bad men coming for us?" Clara's heart clenched at her daughter's attempt to be brave. "I won't let them hurt you." She promised the words, carrying all the fierce protection a mother could summon. "Not you or Samuel, I swear it." "Stay low." Nayati commanded, his rifle coming up in one fluid motion. "Follow the boardwalk. Don't run straight, they shoot straight." 3 riders had emerged from the ridge road, their horses struggling through knee-deep water toward the freight office. Even at this distance, Clara could see they wore the long coats and wide-brimmed hats that marked them as Abel Crick's men. The wire syndicate's enforcers come to clean up loose ends before the flood washed away the evidence of their crimes. "The safe," Clara gasped, understanding, hitting her like a sledgehammer. "They're after the territorial records." Nayati glanced at her with new interest, noting the way her hand pressed protectively against her skirt pocket. "What records?" "Proof." Clara said, her voice tight with desperate hope. bank transfers, forged signatures, everything they did to steal the water rights. If those papers burn, then they win. Nayati finished grimly. A second shot splintered the schoolhouse door, and Clara could hear children crying inside a woman's voice trying to calm their terror. Miss Boone was alive, at least for now. But alive and safe were two very different things in a world gone mad with greed and violence. Clara started toward the school, but Nayati's iron grip on her elbow stopped her cold. "You run straight, they shoot straight," he repeated, pressing his Henry rifle into her trembling hands. The weapon was heavier than she had expected, its metal surfaces warm from his body heat. Clara had never fired a rifle in her life, had never wanted to learn the bloody arithmetic of frontier survival. But as she looked at her children's frightened faces, she found reserves of strength she hadn't known existed. "Hold it low," Nayati instructed his larger hands, guiding hers to the proper grip. His breath was warm against her ear as he showed her the sight picture, the trigger pull the way to breathe with the weapon instead of fighting it. Like this. Feel the balance. For just a moment, his calloused fingers covered hers completely, and Clara felt heat race up her arms that had nothing to do with the blazing sun. She could smell wood smoke and sage in his hair, feel the controlled power in his touch as he shaped her hands to the rifle's contours. The chaos around them faded to background noise as she became intensely aware of his presence. And the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way he positioned himself to shield her from stray bullets. "Trust the weapon," he said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone that suggested he might be speaking of more than just the rifle. "Trust yourself." Then he was moving, flowing across the broken ground like smoke given substance. His shot, when it came, was precise, not at the riders themselves, but at the lead horse. The animal stumbled and went down, throwing its rider into the muddy torrent and buying them precious seconds of confusion. Clara squeezed the trigger, the rifle bucking against her shoulder like a living thing. Her shot went wide by yards, but the sound was enough to send the remaining riders diving for cover behind an overturned freight wagon. "Inside," Nayati called, already moving toward the schoolhouse. "Now." They crashed through the door into controlled chaos. Miss Boone had gathered 6 children on the second floor, their faces streaked with tears and soot, but their eyes bright with the kind of courage that only the very young could summon in the face of the impossible. "Clara," the teacher exclaimed, relief flooding her voice. "Thank heaven you're safe. We heard the shooting and feared the worst." "Abel Crick's men," Clara replied, settling Rose and Samuel with the others, while keeping the rifle ready. "They're burning everything they can't steal." Miss Boone's expression hardened behind her wire-rimmed spectacles. She had watched the wire syndicate slowly strangle these families, had seen her brightest students leave one by one as their parents lost everything to legal thieves and paper bullets. "Can you get the children to the church hill?" Clara asked. The back alley might still be clear. The teacher nodded without hesitation. "Of course. What about you?" Clara met Nayati's winter-water gaze and saw her own determination reflected there. "We're going after those records. Without them, Crick wins everything." "The freight office is across the creek," Miss Boone pointed out. "The bridge is gone." "Railroad trestle," Nayati said simply. "One beam left, narrow but possible." Rose tugged at Clara's skirt, her young face pinched with worry. "Mama, don't go. Please don't leave us." Clara knelt down to her daughter's level, her hands gentle as she smoothed the child's tangled hair. "Listen to me, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have to do dangerous things to keep children safe. Miss Boone will take care of you and Samuel, and I promise, I'll come back to you." "But what if you don't?" Samuel whispered, his 6-year-old voice breaking Clara's heart. "Then you remember that your mama loved you more than anything in this world." Clara said, pressing kisses to both their foreheads. "And you be brave, and you help each other, and you grow up to be good people who stand up for what's right." It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had. The railroad trestle beam stretched across the swollen creek like a bridge made of wishful thinking and desperation. The iron rails had been torn away by the flood's fury, leaving only the narrow wooden support slick with spray and barely wide enough for one person at a time. Clara stood at the edge, her stomach churning as she watched debris race past 20 feet below. The water moved with the violence of nature, unleashed, carrying away fence posts, chicken coops, what might have been a child's wooden horse, all the detritus of human dreams swept away in brown fury. "Don't look down," Nayati advised, already moving onto the beam with the fluid balance of a man who had walked impossible places. "Too late for that," Clara muttered, but she followed anyway, her hands white-knuckled on the guide wire. The spray from below soaked through her dress, immediately making the fabric heavy and treacherous. Each step was a negotiation with death, every gust of wind, a reminder that the torrent below cared nothing for human ambitions or the children waiting for her return. Halfway across, disaster struck. A waterlogged board cracked under Nayati's weight, with a sound like breaking bones, sending him spinning toward the abyss below. His left arm caught the wire, and Clara heard his sharp intake of breath as the twisted metal bit deep into old scar tissue. "Keep moving," he grunted, hauling himself back into the beam with grim determination. But Clara was already there, her hands working frantically to tear a strip from her petticoat. "You're bleeding," she said, wrapping the makeshift bandage around his forearm where fresh blood welled from the cut. Their faces were inches apart as she worked close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to feel his breath on her cheek. Her fingers trembled as she tied the knot, not from fear of falling, but from something else entirely, an awareness of this man that went beyond mere survival partnership. "I'm alive," Nayati replied through gritted teeth, his gaze holding hers for a heartbeat longer than necessity required. Different thing entirely. Something passed between them in that moment, suspended over churning death, a recognition deeper than words. Clara had touched this man's blood before, had felt his life pulse beneath her fingers beside a distant river. Now balanced over certain death, she felt that same connection, fragile as spun glass, strong as forged steel. "The scar," Clara said suddenly, her eyes fixed on the pale line that ran along his forearm. "I remember. You were hunting elk and the bear came out of nowhere." Nayati's expression shifted, surprise replacing pain. "You remember that day?" "I remember a warrior who could have died but chose to live." Clara said, her fingers still gentle on his wound. "And a child who drew pictures in the dirt while I worked." "Tokala," Nayati said, his voice carrying a weight of grief that made Clara's chest tighten. "My sister's boy. They took him 6 months ago." The words hit Clara like physical blows. The child from her memory, the frightened boy who had watched her bandage his uncle's wounds, he was one of the missing, one of the stolen. The personal stakes of their mission suddenly became clear, and with them, her understanding of the man beside her deepened. They reached the far side as a burning wagon crashed into the schoolhouse stairs behind them. Flames billowed up like an offering to indifferent gods, but Miss Boone and the children were already gone, hopefully safe on the church hill where the flood couldn't reach. The freight office window gave way easily to Nayati's elbow. They crawled inside as water lapped at the floorboards, rising by inches with each passing minute. The safe sat in the corner like an iron monument to territorial bureaucracy, its door sealed tight against the world's troubles. Clara knelt beside the lock, her fingers working the combination with muscle memory she wished she could forget. Edwin had made her memorize these numbers during one of his paranoid episodes, claiming they opened a bank vault in Denver that existed only in his suspicious imagination. The tumblers clicked home and the door swung open to reveal stacks of payroll moneyland deeds, tied with red ribbon and a black leather ledger. But it was the packet of letters in the back that made her blood run cold. Sealed with Edwin Hawthorne's own signet ring, the correspondence bore dates from the months before his death. Clara's hands shook as she began to break the seal, but before she could examine the letters, a rifle butt smashed through the window frame. Abel Crick himself stood in the opening water, streaming from his hat brim and long coat. His pale eyes held the bright madness of a man watching everything slip away like sand through grasping fingers. "Well now," he drawled, his voice carrying soft menace. "If it ain't the little songbird and her red devil friend. Been looking forward to this conversation." Nayati yanked Clara down as bullets chewed splinters from the desk above their heads. Trapped in the flooding office, Clara clutched the ledger to her chest while Nayati pressed against the overturned desk. The brown water was rising steadily, and she could hear Crick's men splashing closer. "Back door," Nayati said quietly, nodding toward the rear of the office. The door was warped and jammed tight, but they had no choice. Clara stuffed the packet of letters deep into her bodice, while Nayati positioned himself to force the barrier. "On 3, he whispered. They hit the door together, their combined strength finally overcoming warped wood and rusted hinges. The barrier exploded outward into the flood, and they plunged into waist-deep water that tasted of mud and broken dreams. Behind them, Crick's voice rose in fury. "Burn it! Burn everything!" The current was strong enough to knock Clara off her feet, but Nayati's hand found her belt steadying her as they fought toward the rail yard. In the chaos of smoke and rising water, his touch lingered longer than strictly necessary, his palm warm and reassuring against the small of her back. At the depot, Silas Merrick's voice called from the roof. "Up here, quickly now." The white-haired yardmaster helped haul them to safety just as a hand-cranked Gatling gun with a gravity-fed magazine appeared in the distance, its brass mechanism gleaming deadly in the afternoon light. The weapon was mired in mud, but perfectly positioned to rake the depot with mechanical death. "That contraption's got more teeth than a timber wolf," Merrick muttered, rigging a pulley system with the coal hoist. They descended into the coal yard using the black dust as camouflage. When Clara slipped on the wet coal, Nayati's arm came around her waist, pulling her against his chest. They stood pressed together for a heartbeat, breathing hard, and Clara felt something shift between them. An intimacy born of shared danger, but deepening into something more. "You saved me then," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the distant gunfire. Clara remembered that day by the Missouri, the bare-mauled warrior, the frightened child, her own hands slick with blood, as she worked to save a stranger's life. "Don't let go now," she whispered. His grip tightened, and she felt her heart skip as his thumb traced a gentle circle against her ribs, barely a caress, but unmistakably tender. A sniper's rifle cracked from the cottonwoods ahead. They were trapped between the Gatling gun behind and the hidden marksman ahead, with floodwater rising on both sides. "Underwater," Nayati said, pointing to the submerged irrigation ditch. "It's our only chance." Clara looked at the muddy torrent with terror, but Nayati was already stripping off his vest and shirt. "Trade," he said, offering her his lighter clothing. She changed quickly, turning away from the men with frontier modesty, but intensely aware of Nayati's winter-dark gaze. His leather vest fit her badly, but moved with her body warm from his skin and carrying his scent of wood smoke and sage. They entered the ditch together, the cold water closing over their heads like liquid night. Immediately, Clara's world became a nightmare of choking darkness and crushing pressure. The current pushed her against submerged debris, broken fence posts, tangled wire, the skeletal remains of what might once have been a chair. Her lungs burned as panic clawed at her mind. I'm going to die here, she thought desperately. Rose and Samuel will be orphans, and I'll never know if Edwin's secrets could have saved anyone. But then Nayati's hand found hers in the murk fingers intertwining with desperate strength as he guided her through the underwater maze. In that touch, Clara found something she had never expected: absolute trust. This man, this warrior she had met only hours ago, held her life in his hands. And somehow she knew with bone-deep certainty that he would not let her drown. His grip became her anchor, his presence her guide through the suffocating darkness. When debris blocked their path, she felt him adjust their course without breaking stride. When her lungs threatened to betray her, his squeeze on her fingers reminded her to hold on just a little longer. The trust was mutual, she realized. Nayati was guiding her, yes, but he was also depending on her to match his movements, to trust his judgment, even when every instinct screamed at her to surface and breathe. They moved together through the liquid darkness, like dancers performing a deadly ballet, each utterly dependent on the other for survival. When they finally surfaced behind a fallen log, Clara gasped air like a woman reborn. Her hair was plastered to her skull, and Nayati's shirt clung to her like a second skin. Their eyes met across the small space, and something electric passed between them. Awareness, attraction, the recognition of two souls who had found each other in the darkest possible circumstances. I thought, Clara began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the terror she had felt. I know, Nayati said simply, water streaming from his dark hair. But you trusted me. I did, Clara replied, the admission carrying weight that went far beyond their underwater escape. I do. Nayati moved through the trees with deadly silence, eliminating the sniper with brutal efficiency. When he returned, limping more heavily, Clara was waiting with torn strips from her petticoat. Let me, she said softly, binding his fresh wounds with gentle hands. This time neither of them spoke, but the air between them hummed with unspoken possibilities. They climbed toward the church together, and Clara felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders. At the top, under the shelter of the porch, she finally opened Edwin's letters. The first letter revealed Edwin as a willing participant in Crick's scheme, not a victim. The second detailed how he had used Clara's compassionate nature as a weapon against her neighbors. But it was the third letter that shattered her world completely. Edwin described seeking information about the Indian woman his wife had helped, hoping to use it as leverage. Enclosed was a child's drawing, a hawk feather sketched in charcoal, signed Tokala. Clara's throat constricted as memory flooded back. That frightened child by the Missouri River, drawing pictures while she bandaged his uncle's wounds. Edwin had stolen those innocent gifts and turned them into tools for hunting the very people she had tried to help. Tokala, she whispered. My nephew, Nayati, said, his voice flat as winter stone. 14 summers now. They took him to the mine. The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but Clara could hear it nonetheless, the grief of a man who had lost the child of his heart to men who saw human beings as property to be bought and sold. The locket at Clara's throat rattled. Inside, instead of Edwin's portrait, was a claim ticket from Lone Fir Mine dated 1 week ago, made out to E. Hawthorne for delivery of property. But there was more, a map drawn in Edwin's careful hand, showing not just the mine's location, but something else, a hidden cache of gold and territorial bonds that Edwin had been skimming from Crick's operation. Her husband hadn't just been working for the syndicate, he had been planning to destroy it and steal everything for himself. The mine. Clara said, her voice steady despite the storm in her heart. If Tokala is still alive, we can save him. But there's something else. Edwin hid evidence there. Enough to bring down not just Crick, but his whole network. Nayati studied her face in the lamplight, and Clara saw something shift in his expression. Not judgment for her husband's crimes, but understanding of the burden she now carried. "The flood gives us hours," he said quietly. "After that, the gulch becomes a mudslide trap." Clara looked at her sleeping children through the church window. Rose and Samuel innocent of their father's sins. They needed their mother, but somewhere in a mine shaft, a Lakota boy waited for rescue that might never come. The weight of choice pressed down on her like a physical thing. Her own children's safety against the life of a boy she had never met, but somehow felt responsible for. Edwin's betrayal had created this situation, had put Tokala in danger. Did that give her a moral obligation to risk everything to save him? As if reading her thoughts, Nayati spoke quietly. "You don't owe me this, Clara. Tokala is my blood, my responsibility. Your children need their mother." Clara turned to face him, fully seeing in his eyes the same terrible conflict that tore at her own heart, the desperate need to save Tokala, warring with his understanding of what he was asking her to risk. "That day by the river," she said slowly, "when I helped you, did you think about the danger, about what your people might say about accepting help from a white woman?" Nayati was quiet for a moment. "No," he said finally. "I thought about living, about Tokala growing up with his uncle instead of alone." "Then you understand," Clara said, her decision crystallizing with the certainty of sunrise. "Some things are worth the risk." She turned toward the church entrance, then paused. "Miss Boone," she called softly. The teacher appeared, understanding immediately what Clara was asking. "They'll be safe here. I give you my word." Clara kissed her children's foreheads, breathing in their innocent scent of soap and sleep. "Be brave," she whispered to Rose. "Take care of your brother. I'll come back to you." Then she turned to follow Nayati into the mountain darkness, carrying the weight of terrible knowledge and a growing certainty that her partnership with this warrior was becoming something deeper, more dangerous, and infinitely more precious than she had ever dared imagine. The ferry across the main channel was a death trap, held together by rust and prayer. But it was their only way to reach Lone Fir Mine. As they worked the screaming crank mechanism, Clara found herself watching Nayati's hands, strong, scarred, gentle, when they had touched her face to check for injuries after their escape from the schoolhouse. Silas Merrick had insisted on joining them despite his wounds. "Worked those mine gears back in '69, he said. "Know every tunnel and shaft. Besides that boy you're after, he reminds me of my grandson. Some things a man can't walk away from." As they cranked the ferry across the treacherous current, Clara found herself thinking about the strange turns life could take. This morning, she had been a widow trying to protect her children from a flood. Now she was crossing a raging torrent to rescue a boy she barely remembered, guided by a man she was beginning to care for in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. When a massive log struck the ferry like a battering ram, spinning them like a child's top, Nayati's arm came around Clara's waist again. This time she didn't pull away. Instead, she found herself leaning into his strength, her hand resting against his chest, where she could feel his heart hammering beneath her palm. "Easy," he murmured against her ear, his voice carrying tenderness that made her breath catch. In that moment, suspended over churning death with his arms around her, Clara felt something she thought she had lost forever, the possibility of love that wasn't based on possession or control, but on mutual respect and shared purpose. They reached the far bank as the cable snapped and began climbing toward the mine through rain that had started to fall like tears from an indifferent sky. The gulch rose before them like a wound in the earth, and somewhere in those heights, Tokala waited if he still lived. As they walked, Clara found herself studying Nayati's profile in the dim light. There was something about him that spoke to parts of her soul she had forgotten, existed a strength that protected, rather than dominated, a gentleness that coexisted with deadly capability. "Tell me about him," she said quietly. "About Tokala." Nayati was silent for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of deep affection and deeper loss. "His mother was my sister Winona. She died in the scarlet fever 3 winters ago. Tokala came to live with me, a boy who had lost everything but somehow kept laughing." Nayati's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "He draws everything he sees. Horses, eagles, storms. He drew that picture you found, the hawk feather, after you helped us by the river." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she imagined a young boy processing kindness through art, creating something beautiful to remember a moment of grace in a harsh world. "He asked me once why the white woman helped us when her own people would not," Nayati continued. "I told him that goodness has no color, that some hearts see suffering and must act to heal it. He drew a picture of that too, a woman with gentle hands touching a warrior's wounds." The image hit Clara like a physical blow. In Edwin's correspondence, she had seen only betrayal and manipulation. But there had been another perspective, all along, a child's vision of kindness, bridging the gap between peoples, creating connection where others saw only division. "When Crick's men took him," Nayati said, his voice hardening, "Tokala was teaching the younger children to make paint from berries and clay. They said he fought like a wildcat, protecting the little ones until the very end." Clara's hand found Nayati's arm, offering what comfort she could. "We'll find him," she said with fierce certainty. "We'll bring him home." Nayati's eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her heart race, not just gratitude, but recognition. He saw her, Clara realized, not as Edwin's widow or the children's mother, but as herself, as a woman capable of courage and compassion, worthy of respect and partnership. "Clara," he said, her name carrying weight that went far beyond mere address. "Whatever happens up there, we'll face it together." Clara interrupted, understanding what he was trying to say. "That's what partners do." Lone Fir Mine clung to the mountainside like a metal parasite, its stamp mill pounding rhythmically in the night. Through the yellow glow of kerosene lanterns, Clara could see thin figures moving between the machinery. Children worked like slaves in a place that should have been shut down years ago. "There," Nayati breathed, pointing to a slight figure near the main flywheel. Even at this distance, Clara could see the proud set of the boy's shoulders, the way he moved with careful dignity, despite months of brutal labor. Tokala was alive, and that knowledge sent strength coursing through her veins like wine. The plan was simple and deadly. Nayati would create a distraction, while Clara and Merrick disabled the machinery. But as they circled toward the mill, Clara spotted something that made her pulse race, a separate building smaller than the others, with Edwin's mark carved into the doorframe. "His cache," she whispered, pointing. "Whatever Edwin hid here, it's in that building." They split up, Merrick heading for the steam engine that powered the stamps, Clara toward Edwin's secret storehouse, and Nayati moving like a ghost toward the mill floor, where his nephew labored under the overseer's whip. Clara forced the lock on Edwin's building with a prying bar, her heart pounding as the door swung open to reveal stacks of territorial bonds, bags of gold dust, and, most importantly, a second ledger that detailed every corrupt transaction from Denver to Washington itself. Edwin had been keeping records of his own insurance against the day he decided to bring down his partners and claim everything for himself. But as she stuffed the evidence into her grain sack, shots erupted from the mill floor. Through the window, she saw Nayati step into the lamplight, speaking rapid Lakota to Tokala. The boy's head snapped up, hope blazing in his young face. But the mine foreman Magruder was raising his pistol with deadly intent. Clara didn't think she simply acted. Bursting from the storehouse, she put herself between the gun and the man she had come to care for, more than she dared admit. "Stop!" she shouted, raising Edwin's ledger like a shield. "I have everything. Every name, every transaction, every corrupt deal from here to the territorial capital." Magruder's shot went wide as Tokala slammed a coal shovel into his gun hand. Nayati closed the distance with lethal efficiency, dropping the overseer with a single precise blow. "Everyone out," Clara called to the imprisoned children. "You're free." But even as the young prisoners began to scatter, she could hear new sounds echoing through the gulch, and the thunder of hooves, the crash of men moving through the brush, the harsh voice of Abel Crick himself getting closer with each passing second. Merrick had succeeded in cutting the main belt, sending the machinery grinding to a halt. But their escape route was cut off as Crick's remaining men flooded into the mine complex like water through a broken dam. They retreated toward the ore chute, the only way down to the processing yard, as flames began to lick at the mill building behind them. One by one, the children slid down the treacherous wooden slope, Clara and Nayati, bringing up the rear with Tokala between them. At the bottom, they found themselves trapped in a narrow canyon, with only one way out the bridge that spanned the gulch like a knife blade, balanced on hope. But even as they reached it, Crick's men were taking positions at the far end and their rifles glinting in the firelight. That was when Merrick made his choice. The old yardmaster shouldered a crate of dynamite, his weathered face grim with determination. "Get them clear," he called. "When this goes, it's going big." The explosion, when it came, was everything he had promised, an eruption of light and sound that seemed to tear the world apart. The bridge collapsed in a shower of twisted metal and burning timber, taking Merrick with it and blocking Crick's advance. But they were trapped now, on the wrong side of the canyon, with no way down except a 1,000-foot drop. Clara felt despair clawing at her chest, until Nayati pointed to a narrow ledge that zigzagged down the cliff face. "Deer trail," he said. "Dangerous, but possible." The descent down the treacherous cliff face was a nightmare of loose rock and certain death waiting one slip away. Nayati went first, testing each step, while Clara brought up the rear with her heart in her throat every time one of the children stumbled. They had made it perhaps halfway down when disaster struck again. Not one of the smaller children this time, but Tokala himself, weakened by months of brutal labor and poor food. His foot slipped on a patch of wet stone, sending loose rock cascading into the abyss below. Clara watched in horror as the boy began to fall, his thin hands scrabbling for purchase on the slick surface. Without thinking, she threw herself forward, her body forming a bridge between two sections of the ledge, as Tokala's desperate fingers found her outstretched arm. The impact drove the breath from her lungs and sent fire racing through her shoulder. But she held on with grim determination. Below her, she could hear loose stones clattering into the depths, a reminder of what waited if she let go. "Pull him up," Nayati called, working his way back toward them with agonizing care. But Clara was already doing just that, her muscles straining as she hauled Tokala back onto the narrow ledge. When the boy was safe, gasping and shaking but alive, she found herself looking into eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and recognition. "You," Tokala said in careful English, his young voice carrying wonder. "You are the woman with gentle hands. Uncle told me about you." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she helped the boy to his feet. "And you are the artist," she replied. "I remember your drawings." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that went beyond words. This boy had suffered because of her husband's betrayal, had been torn from his family, and forced into slavery because Edwin had turned a child's innocent gratitude into a weapon. But instead of hatred, Tokala looked at her with something that might have been hope. "We'll get you home." Clara promised, her hand gentle on his shoulder. "I swear it." When they finally reached the bottom, dawn was breaking over the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Around them, the canyon floor was littered with debris from the bridge explosion. But there was no sign of Abel Crick or his men. Clara was gathering the children close when she heard the scrape of boots on stone behind her. She turned to see a nightmare emerging from the morning shadows. Abel Crick and 8 of his remaining men, their clothes torn and filthy, their faces streaked with blood and soot from their climb down the canyon wall. "Nowhere to run now, Songbird," Crick said, his voice carrying across the narrow canyon floor like the whisper of death itself. His pale eyes burned with the kind of madness that came from watching everything slip away. "You've led me a merry chase, but all trails end somewhere." Clara felt ice form in her veins as she realized they were completely trapped. The canyon walls rose sheer on both sides, and the only exits blocked by Crick's men, who had spread out in a semicircle with their weapons trained on the small group of refugees. "The ledgers." Crick continued, gesturing toward the grain sack with his rifle barrel. "Hand them over, and maybe I'll let the children walk away from this." "Maybe." Nayati stepped protectively in front of Clara, and the children, his own rifle ready despite the hopeless odds. Blood seeped through his shirt from wounds old and new, but his hands were steady as stone. "You want something?" he said quietly. "You come and take it." Clara's mind raced as she clutched the grain sack containing both ledgers, Edwin's records, and Crick's own documentation of years of systematic theft and murder. But as her gaze fell on Edwin's packet of letters, she remembered something that made her pulse quicken with sudden hope. According to the hidden correspondence, Crick wasn't just stealing from homesteaders and mining companies. He was also embezzling from the territorial government itself, skimming money meant for Indian treaties and reservation supplies. Money that belonged to Nayati's people, stolen food from the mouths of Lakota children. "You know what's in these ledgers, Abel," Clara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Every treaty payment you've stolen, every dollar, meant for reservation supplies that went into your pocket instead." Crick's laugh was like breaking glass. "Ancient history, Songbird. Dead men tell no tales, and that's what you're all about to become." "Are we?" Clara pulled out Edwin's hidden correspondence, holding it so Crick could see his own name written on the pages. Edwin kept meticulous records of everything, including your plan to blame the missing treaty money on Indian raids that never happened. "How do you think the Lakota are going to react when they learn you've been stealing food from their children's mouths?" She saw Nayati stiffen beside her, understanding immediately what she was revealing. The implications went far beyond simple theft. This was the kind of betrayal that started wars. "You want to know why Edwin really died?" Clara continued, pressing her advantage as she saw uncertainty flicker in Crick's eyes. "He found out about your double dealing and tried to blackmail you. So you had him killed and made it look like an accident. But he was smarter than you gave him credit for. He left evidence of everything: your corruption, your murders, your theft from the government itself." Crick's face had gone pale beneath the dirt and blood. "Even if that's true," he said, his voice not quite as steady as before, "you'll never live to tell anyone about it." "Won't we?" Clara smiled grimly, playing her final card. "I've already sent copies to Judge Morrison in Silver Creek. Even if you kill us all right here, the evidence will still surface. Your only chance is to run, Abel. Run far and run fast, because whether you pull that trigger or not, your empire is finished." It was a desperate bluff, but Crick didn't know that. The uncertainty was eating at him. She could see it in the way his hands trembled slightly on the rifle, the way his eyes darted between her face and the ledger in her hands. "You're lying," he said, but there was doubt in his voice now. "Then pull the trigger." Clara challenged her heart hammering against her ribs. Kill us all, and find out what happens when those ledgers surface without me around to explain them. See how long you last when every lawman in 3 territories is hunting you for murdering children. For a long moment, the tableau held 8 armed men, facing down a woman, a wounded warrior, and a group of frightened children. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, while somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried its hunting song to the empty sky. Then Crick made his choice, but not the one Clara had expected. "You think you're so smart," he snarled, his rifle swinging toward Tokala. "Let's see how smart you are when I start putting bullets in these red devil spawn one by one." That was when the careful balance of terror finally snapped. Clara threw herself forward as Crick's finger tightened on the trigger, but she was too far away, too slow. The shot would find its mark before she could. Nayati moved like lightning made flesh, his wounded body finding reserves of speed and strength that should have been impossible. He covered the distance between himself and Crick in 3 bounding strides, his shoulder driving into the man's midsection just as the rifle discharged. The bullet went wide, chipping stone from the canyon wall, and then the 2 men were rolling on the ground in a tangle of violent motion. Crick was younger and unwounded, but Nayati fought with the desperate fury of a man protecting everything he held dear. Around them, chaos erupted as Crick's men tried to get clear shots at Nayati without hitting their boss. Clara saw her chance and took it, using the confusion to position herself between the gunmen and the children, while shouting at the top of her lungs. "You want the truth about Abel Crick?" She screamed, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "He's been stealing treaty money meant for Indian families. He's the reason Lakota children have been starving while he gets rich." The words hit Nayati like a physical blow, and Clara saw something change in his winter-dark eyes, a cold, killing rage that transformed him from wounded warrior into an instrument of justice. His hands found Crick's throat, and for a moment, the mine owner's struggles became increasingly frantic. But Clara had learned something about herself. In the past few days, she was not a killer, no matter how much someone might deserve death. "Nayati," she called. "Alive. We need him alive to testify." The warrior's hands loosened just enough to let Crick breathe, but his grip remained iron-strong as he hauled the man to his feet. Around them, Crick's surviving men stood frozen, their weapons trained on a target they couldn't shoot without killing their boss. "Drop your guns," Clara ordered, Edwin's ledger held high like a banner of justice. "It's over. Your boss is finished and you know it. The only question now is whether you want to hang with him or walk away." One by one, the weapons clattered to the ground, as hard men made the calculation that their lives were worth more than their loyalty to a dead cause. It was finished, Clara realized, with a mixture of exhaustion and overwhelming relief. After all the violence and terror, it had ended not with more death, but with the simple recognition that truth was more powerful than any gun. The sound of hooves echoing off the canyon walls announced the arrival of Judge Morrison and his deputies, drawn by the explosions and gunfire that had echoed across the territory. The judge took one look at the scene, the defeated gunmen, the rescued children, Abel Crick, held fast in Nayati's unbreakable grip, and nodded with grim satisfaction. "Mrs. Hawthorne?" he said, dismounting from his horse with the careful dignity of a man who had seen too much frontier justice to be surprised by anything. "I believe you have something for me." Clara handed over both ledgers, watching as the judge's weathered face grew increasingly grave as he scanned the evidence of corruption that reached from the territorial capital to Washington itself. "This will take months to unravel completely," Morrison said finally. "But it's enough to clean house from top to bottom. Mr. Crick here will be lucky if he only gets life in prison instead of a hangman's rope." As the deputies secured the prisoners and began the process of documenting evidence, Clara found herself standing apart from the organized chaos, watching Nayati embrace his nephew with the fierce joy of a man who had thought he might never see family again. Tokala was thin from his months of captivity, his wrists bearing the scars of shackles, but there was something unbroken in his spirit that spoke to the resilience of his people. As Clara watched the reunion, she felt tears she hadn't even realized she was shedding track down her cheeks. But then Tokala surprised her by pulling away from his uncle and approaching her with something clutched in his small hand. When he opened his palm, Clara saw a piece of smooth riverstone, worn to perfect roundness by countless years of water and time. "For you," he said in careful English, his young voice carrying solemnity beyond his years. "Uncle taught me that some gifts are too precious to lose. You gave me back my life, so I give you this, a piece of the river where we first met, where you showed kindness to strangers." Clara felt her throat close as she accepted the simple gift. It was nothing valuable by any worldly measure, just a stone worn smooth by time and current. But to this boy, it represented something priceless, the memory of compassion crossing the divide between peoples, creating connection where others saw only difference. "I'll treasure it always," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'll remember that kindness has no color, no boundary except what we create in our own hearts." Tokala smiled in the first truly joyful expression she had seen on his face. And Clara understood that they had both been healed by this exchange, the boy by his rescue, and she by the forgiveness he offered so freely. "It's over," she whispered to herself, hardly able to believe the words. But Nayati heard her, and when he looked up from embracing Tokala, his winter-dark eyes found hers across the crowded canyon floor. In that gaze she saw something that made her heart skip, not just relief or gratitude, but something deeper. Something that spoke of shared trials endured, and a future that might hold possibilities she had never dared imagine. He approached her slowly, favoring his wounded side, Tokala, walking beside him with one hand resting on his uncle's arm. When they reached her, Clara felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like a mantle she was finally ready to wear. "What will you do now?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the sounds of the deputies organizing their prisoners. Nayati was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the distant mountains where morning was giving way to the promise of a new day. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of careful consideration. "Depends," he said simply. "On what?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the morning chill. "On whether a certain widow might need a partner in whatever comes next." Clara felt her breath catch as she looked into his face and saw something there that made her heart race, not just affection or desire, but something deeper. The kind of partnership that could weather any storm, face any challenge, and emerge stronger on the other side. "I might," she said softly, her voice trembling with possibilities she had never dared contemplate. "But it won't be easy. There's a lot of work to do, a lot of wrongs to right." "The best things never are easy," Nayati replied, his hand rising to cup her cheek with infinite tenderness. Around them, the organized chaos of justice continued, as deputies secured evidence and prepared prisoners for transport. But Clara barely heard any of it. Her entire world had narrowed to this moment, this man, this choice that would define the rest of her life. When Nayati's lips found hers, it was with the gentleness of a man who understood that some things were worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth building a future around. The kiss tasted of hope and new beginnings of partnerships, forged in fire and tempered by shared adversity. When they finally broke apart, Clara was breathless, but smiling, her hands resting against his chest, where she could feel his heart beating strong and steady beneath her palms. Partners, then. She said the word carrying promises that went far beyond simple business arrangements. Partners. Nayati agreed, and in that simple response, Clara heard the commitment of a man who understood that love was not possession, but choice, not conquest, but collaboration. As they prepared to leave the canyon with Judge Morrison and his deputies, Clara noticed that Nayati was favoring his wounded side more heavily, his face pale with blood loss and exhaustion. Without hesitation, she moved to his injured side, offering her shoulder for support. "Let me," she said, her arm circling his waist as they began the slow climb out of the canyon. But instead of simply accepting her help, Nayati's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with a naturalness that spoke of deeper connection. As they walked together toward whatever the future might hold, Clara felt the rightness of it settle into her bones like a truth she had always known, but never acknowledged. As they reached the rim of the canyon and prepared for the journey to Silver Creek, Clara saw Nayati wince as his wounded side pulled against the makeshift bandages. Without a word, she guided him to a flat boulder and began unwrapping the blood-soaked cloth. "Hold still," she said, her hands gentle but sure as she examined the damage. The cuts were deep but clean, and with proper care they would heal without permanent harm. As she worked using strips torn from her petticoat to create fresh bandages, Clara was intensely aware of Nayati's gaze on her face. When she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression of wonder that made her cheeks warm. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Just thinking," he said quietly, "about how a woman's gentle hands can be both healing and strength, both mercy and justice." Clara's breath caught at the reverence in his voice, at the way he was looking at her, as if she were something precious and rare. When she finished tying off the bandage, her hands lingered on his skin, and she felt the electric awareness that had been building between them finally crystallize into something undeniable. "Clara," he said, her name a whisper that carried the weight of everything they had shared and everything they might become. She answered without words, her hand rising to cup his cheek as his had cupped hers. When their lips met this time, it was with the certainty of two people who had found their match in all the ways that mattered: strength and gentleness, courage and compassion, the willingness to fight for justice, and the wisdom to choose mercy when mercy was called for. They broke apart reluctantly, both breathing hard, both aware that Judge Morrison and his deputies were waiting patiently for them to finish their private moment. But as they rose to rejoin the group, Nayati's hand remained firmly clasped in Clara's, and she knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Epilogue. 3 months later, Clara stood in Judge Morrison's courthouse in Silver Creek, watching as the final pieces of Abel Crick's empire crumbled to dust. The judge had just finished reading the sentence, "Life in territorial prison for Crick himself," with several of his associates facing the hangman's noose for their roles in multiple murders. But the courtroom drama was just the visible tip of a much larger victory. The evidence Clara had risked everything to obtain had triggered investigations reaching all the way to Washington, resulting in the dismissal of corrupt territorial officials and the implementation of new protections for water rights and homestead claims. "It's finished then," she said to Judge Morrison as the courtroom emptied. "This part is." The judge replied, his weathered face showing satisfaction, tempered by knowledge of how much work remained. "But you and Mr. Ghostwalker have started something that will ripple outward for years to come. Already we've received reports of similar corruption in 3 other territories, all being investigated based on the methods Crick used here." Through the courthouse window, Clara could see Nayati helping Tokala into the wagon they had loaded with supplies for the families beginning to return to their reclaimed homesteads. The boy had recovered much of his strength, though he still bore the inner scars of his captivity. But he had also found his voice again, teaching the other rescued children how to make paint from berries and clay, turning trauma into art and healing. Mrs. Hawthorne, Judge Morrison said, "There's something else you should know. We received word from the territorial governor this morning. He's asked me to offer you a position as territorial advocate for homestead rights. The salary would be modest, but the work would be meaningful." Clara felt a flutter of excitement, then uncertainty. "I'm honored, Judge, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for such a position." "After what you've accomplished?" Morrison chuckled. "Mrs. Hawthorne, you've just brought down a corruption network that had been stealing from families for years. I'd say you're more than qualified." Before Clara could respond, the courthouse door opened, and Nayati entered his presence, filling the room with quiet strength. In the months since their return to Silver Creek, he had become something of a legend himself, the Lakota warrior who had worked alongside a white widow to bring justice to the territory. "Ready?" he asked Clara, his eyes holding the warmth that had become as familiar to her as breathing. "Almost," she replied, then turned back to Judge Morrison. "About that position, could I think about it? Discuss it with my partner?" Morrison's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Outside the courthouse, Clara found Rose and Samuel playing with Tokala near the wagon, their laughter carrying on the autumn air. The sight filled her with contentment that went bone deep. Her children had adapted to their new life with remarkable resilience, and they clearly adored both Nayati and Tokala. "Mama," Rose called, running to her with arms outstretched. "Tokala taught us how to make pictures with mud and berries." "Did he now?" Clara said, scooping up her daughter and marveling at how much the child had grown in just a few months. "And what did you draw?" "Our family," Samuel said proudly, showing her a piece of bark covered with colorful handprints. "See, there's you and me, and Rose, and Mr. Nayati, and Tokala." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at the simple artwork. Her children had included Nayati and Tokala without question, creating a family portrait that reflected the reality they had all built together. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Nayati appeared at her elbow, his hand coming to rest gently on her back. "Judge Morrison had news?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded and then explained about the territorial advocate position. As she spoke, she watched Nayati's face, looking for any sign of what he thought about the opportunity. "It's good work," he said finally. "Important work, and you'd be excellent at it." "We'd be excellent at it," Clara corrected. "Partners, remember?" Nayati's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Partners," he agreed. They loaded the children into the wagon and began the journey to their first official task as partners, helping the Kowalski family rebuild their homestead now that their water rights had been restored. It was small work in the grand scheme of things, but Clara had learned that justice was built one family at a time, one act of service at a time. As they drove through the countryside, where autumn was painting the cottonwoods gold and scarlet, Clara felt a deep sense of rightness about the path her life had taken. She thought about Edwin and his betrayals, about the corruption they had uncovered, about all the lives that had been damaged by greed and hatred. But she also thought about the healing that was possible when people chose to stand together against darkness. The Kowalski farm appeared ahead of them, smoke rising from the chimney of a rebuilt cabin, children playing in a yard where vegetables grew green and strong thanks to restored water rights. Martha Kowalski appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up when she saw the wagon approaching. "Clara Nayati," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. "Perfect timing. John just finished putting up the new fence posts, and little Anna has been asking when Tokala would come back to teach her more drawing. As they unloaded supplies and shared the evening meal with the Kowalski family, Clara felt the satisfaction that came from work that mattered, from partnerships built on respect and shared purpose, from love that had grown naturally out of mutual admiration and trust. Later, as the children played together in the yard, and the adults sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope, Nayati's hand found Clara's, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "No regrets?" he asked softly, echoing the question he had posed months earlier. Clara thought about everything that had brought them to this moment: the flood and the fear, the violence and the loss, the terrible discoveries about Edwin's betrayal. But she also thought about the courage she had found within herself, the partnership she had built with this remarkable man, the family they had created together. "Only that it took so long to find you." She said the same answer she had given before, but with even deeper conviction now. When Nayati's lips found hers, it was with the confidence of a man who knew he was loved completely and unconditionally. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the sounds of their extended family filled the evening air, Clara knew that she had finally found what she had been searching for all her life: a place to belong, a person to love, and a future worth building together. The frontier could be harsh and unforgiving, but it also offered something precious to those brave enough to claim it: the chance to become exactly who you were meant to be, in partnership with someone who understood that the greatest victories were won not through force or deception, but through the simple courage to stand together against whatever darkness the world might hold. As the evening deepened and they prepared for the journey home, Clara felt Nayati's hand tighten around hers, a simple gesture that carried the weight of commitment, the promise of partnership, and the quiet certainty that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, and they would face them together. In the distance, a night bird called its hunting song to the stars, and Clara smiled, knowing that she and Nayati had found their own song at last, a harmony built on trust, tempered by adversity, and destined to last for all the years to come.